The Midnight Death Omen, a New Year's Tale. Before we start tonight's tale, take the time to like this video and subscribe to my channel to never miss one of my new stories. Settle yourself comfortably. Let your breathing slow. Allow the tensions of the day to drift away like leaves on a gentle stream. Close your eyes if you wish, and let yourself be carried back through the past at the end of the holiday season. Chapter 1. The Waiting Hour. The town of Hollowmere had always kept its secrets close, wrapped in the mist that rolled down from the mountains each winter evening. On this particular New Year's Eve, as the final hours of the year ticked away, those secrets seemed to press against every windowpane, seeking entrance into the warmth where families gathered. In the central square, workers had erected the traditional decorations, garlands of evergreen boughs wound around lampposts, their needles releasing that sharp, clean scent of pine into the cold air. Children ran between their parents' legs, clutching sparklers that traced golden arcs through the darkness. Yet beneath the celebration, something older stirred, a remembrance that predated the electric lights and the modern calendar itself. The superstition was never spoken of openly, certainly not in front of children or outsiders. It belonged to the grandmothers who still crossed themselves when mentioning the dead, to the grandfathers who remembered when the town's oldest church still rang its bells by hand. They knew, as their parents had known, and their parents before them. If someone died at the precise stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve, the coming year would be marked by death. This belief had roots that stretched back through centuries of European folklore, where the turning of the year was considered a liminal time, a threshold between worlds when the veil grew thin. In medieval communities across the continent, from the Germanic forests to the Celtic highlands, midnight on New Year's was treated with a mixture of celebration and caution. It was a moment of transformation, when one year died and another was born. And in that death and rebirth, anything might slip through. Historical records from various European regions document similar beliefs. In parts of Germany, the tradition of Silvesterabend, New Year's Eve, named after Pope Sylvester I, who died on December 31st, 335 CE, included customs designed to ward off evil spirits and death during the year's transition. In Scotland, the Hogmanay celebrations included intricate rituals to ensure the new year would be prosperous rather than deadly. The first-footer tradition, where the first person to cross a threshold after midnight would determine the household's fortune, spoke to this same anxiety about the year's opening moments. The belief in midnight's power wasn't arbitrary. Before mechanical clocks standardized time, midnight represented a conceptual moment rather than a precise second. It was the deepest part of night, when humans are most vulnerable, when body temperature drops to its lowest point, when, as medieval physicians observed, the sick most often died. The human circadian rhythm reaches its nadir around this hour. Even today, hospital death records show a small but measurable increase in deaths between midnight and 3 in the morning. Chapter 2. The Solitary Vigil. On the edge of Hollowmere, in a cottage that had witnessed the turn of more than 200 years, Elias Thorne sat alone. At 73, he had become a fixture in the town's landscape, a quiet man who tended his garden in summer and spent winters reading by firelight. His wife, Margaret, had passed 5 years earlier, not at midnight, but in the gentle afternoon of a spring day, sunlight filtering through lace curtains. Tonight, Elias found he could not join the festivities in town. His bones ached with cold, but more than that, a heaviness had settled upon him throughout December, a weariness that sleep could not cure, a weight behind his sternum that made breathing an act of conscious will. He had set only 2 candles burning, their flames casting elongated shadows across the wooden walls. The grandfather clock in the corner, a wedding gift from Margaret's parents, ticked with mechanical precision. In the age before standardized time, such clocks were rare, almost magical instruments. The history of clockmaking reveals humanity's obsession with measuring and controlling time, particularly around significant moments. The first mechanical clocks appeared in medieval European monasteries around the 13th century, devices meant to regulate the hours of prayer. But it wasn't until the 14th and 15th centuries that domestic clocks became symbols of wealth and, more interestingly, of power over death itself. To own a clock was to possess a tool that made visible the invisible passage of time, to see the seconds of life draining away, or, conversely, to master time's progression. Elias watched the minute hand creep toward the 12. His own pocket watch lay on the table beside him, its face reflecting candlelight. He had wound it that morning, as he did every morning, a habit so ingrained he performed it without thought. Margaret used to tease him about this ritual, calling him punctual to a fault. Now, watching time's passage felt like witnessing his own life's equation, so many heartbeats remaining, so many breaths yet to take. Outside, he could hear distant voices carried on the wind, the town's celebration building toward its crescendo. There would be champagne toasts, kisses at midnight, resolutions declared with the earnestness that alcohol and collective effervescence inspire. Elias remembered such celebrations from his younger years, the sense that midnight marked a genuine boundary, that crossing it meant leaving behind old failures and stepping into possibility. But the old superstition troubled him tonight in a way it never had before. He had heard it first from his own grandmother, who had heard it from hers, a chain of whispered warnings extending back into the murky past. The belief held that a midnight death on New Year's Eve was an omen, a dark prophecy written in mortality's language. The person who died became a harbinger, passing a prologue to widespread death in the coming year. Anthropologists who study death folklore note that such beliefs serve specific social functions. In pre-modern communities, where death rates were high and medical knowledge limited, omens provided a sense of order and prediction in the face of randomness. If you could read the signs, the flight of birds, the howling of dogs, the timing of a death, perhaps you could prepare, protect, or at least understand why tragedy struck. Chapter 3. The Stroke of Midnight. The clock showed 11:58. Elias felt his heart laboring in his chest, a stuttering rhythm that had become familiar over recent months. He had not told anyone about the episodes, the sudden breathlessness, the pain radiating down his left arm, the gray fog that descended over his vision. At his age, he reasoned, such things were to be expected. Bodies wore out, like machines that had run too long without maintenance. In the square, the countdown had begun. Voices rose in unison. 10, 9, 8. Even through closed windows and across the distance, Elias could hear them, could imagine the upturned faces, the champagne bottles ready to spray foam into the air, the strangers preparing to embrace. 7, 6, 5. Margaret had loved New Year's Eve. She would plan for weeks, preparing food, decorating their small cottage, insisting they stay up to watch the new year arrive. "It's important," she would say, her eyes bright with conviction. "You have to be awake for the change, otherwise you miss it, and the whole year starts off wrong." 4, 3, 2. Elias closed his eyes. The pain in his chest was spreading now, a crushing weight that made each breath a battle. Somewhere in his mind, a clinical voice noted the symptoms: myocardial infarction, left coronary artery blockage, cardiac muscle dying from lack of oxygen. But the louder voice was Margaret's, calling him toward rest, toward the sleep that wouldn't end. 1. Happy New Year. The grandfather clock began to chime. Deep, sonorous notes that vibrated in the floorboards, in the walls, in Elias's failing heart. He opened his eyes and watched the second hand sweep past the 12. In the square, fireworks exploded, painting the night sky in cascades of green and gold and red. People kissed and laughed and sang. The clock chimed 12 times. On the final stroke, as the sound faded into the cold night air, Elias Thorne exhaled once more and did not inhale again. His body settled into the chair, his hand still resting on the arm, his face peaceful in the candlelight. The pocket watch on the table continued ticking, marking seconds that no longer mattered to its owner. Outside, Hollowmere celebrated, unaware that in a cottage on its edge, the old superstition had claimed a new chapter. Chapter 4: The Statistics of Death. To understand why such folklore persists, one must examine the actual patterns of death. Medical researchers have long studied whether certain times carry higher mortality risk. Studies published in journals like The Lancet and the American Journal of Epidemiology reveal fascinating patterns in death timing. Research analyzing millions of death certificates shows that deaths do peak slightly in winter months, particularly around January, but this has biological rather than supernatural causes. Cold weather stresses cardiovascular systems, influenza season reaches its height, and reduced sunlight affects mental health and immune function. The January effect in mortality statistics is well documented across Northern Hemisphere countries. However, no credible scientific study has ever found evidence that deaths occurring at midnight on New Year's Eve predict increased mortality in the subsequent year. What studies have found is confirmation bias, the human tendency to remember hits and forget misses. If someone dies at midnight on New Year's and the following year sees notable deaths, people remember the correlation. If no unusual mortality follows, the midnight death is forgotten or attributed to different causes. Dr. Philip Shively, a sociologist who studied death superstitions in rural European communities in the 1970s, found that the midnight death omen belief was strongest in areas where record-keeping was historically poor. When people couldn't reliably track whether a year actually had experienced higher mortality, the belief could flourish unchallenged. In communities with detailed parish records dating back centuries, the superstition had less hold, because anyone could verify that midnight deaths had no predictive power. Yet the persistence of such beliefs across cultures reveals something profound about human psychology. We are pattern-seeking creatures, desperate to find meaning in randomness, to believe that death follows rules we might learn and perhaps, eventually, circumvent. Chapter 5: The Discovery. Mrs. Chen, Elias's neighbor, discovered him the next morning. She had promised to bring him leftover dumplings from her family's New Year's celebration, a tradition she had maintained since Margaret's death. When he didn't answer her knock, she let herself in. She had a key for emergencies, and found him still sitting in his chair, cold to the touch, the candles burned down to stubs. The doctor who came to pronounce death and sign the certificate noted the time as approximately midnight, December 31st, based on witness statements and body temperature. He wrote myocardial infarction as cause of death, a medical explanation that accounted for everything except why this particular heart failed at this particular moment. Mrs. Chen, 70 herself and raised by a grandmother who knew the old ways, felt her stomach turn cold. She said nothing to the doctor, but as soon as he left, she called her sister, who called her daughter, who mentioned it to a friend at the grocery store. By midday, the whisper had circulated through Holomo's older generation. Elias Thorne had died at midnight on New Year's Eve. Don't speak of it, the elders warned each other. No sense frightening people. But the knowledge sat heavy in their minds, a shadow cast forward across the coming 12 months. They watched and waited, these keepers of folklore, these believers in patterns older than science. Chapter 6. The year unfolds. January passed into February with normal mortality. Old Mr. Brennan, 97, died of pneumonia, but he had been declining for months. In March, a car accident on the highway claimed a traveling salesman, but such tragedies happen every year. April brought spring and the usual renewal, gardens emerging from winter dormancy, children returning to outdoor play. Yet in May, something shifted. A late season flu swept through the elementary school, and one child, little Emma Hartwell, just 7 years old, developed complications. Bacterial pneumonia, the doctors said, rare but not unheard of in post-viral cases. She died on May 12th, and the town mourned with the fierce grief that child death brings, the sense that something in the natural order has been violated. 2 weeks later, a construction accident at the new shopping center took the life of Tom Prescott, a foreman who had worked on every major building project in Holomere for 30 years. Then in June, Sarah Mitchell, a high school teacher beloved by students, had a stroke while driving and crashed into a telephone pole. She was 43. The deaths accumulated. By themselves, each could be explained: illness, accident, misfortune. Together, they formed a pattern that the superstitious recognized and the rational refused to see. At the supermarket, in church pews, at the post office, the elders exchanged glances that carried entire conversations. It's happening, those looks said. The omen is fulfilling itself. But was it actually happening? This question cuts to the heart of how folklore operates in human consciousness. Psychologists call this phenomenon confirmation bias combined with frequency illusion. Once you're looking for something, you see it everywhere. The average mortality rate in Holomere ran about 12 to 15 deaths per year in a population of approximately 2,000. Some years saw 8 deaths, others 20, depending on flu severity, accident rates, and the simple randomness of human mortality. The question wasn't whether deaths were occurring, they always occur, but whether their frequency or nature had actually changed. Mrs. Chen kept a list in her diary, noting each death, the date, the circumstances. By July, she had counted 11 deaths. Last year, she remembered, there had been 9 by this time. The year before that, 12. But memory is unreliable. Had she counted only the notable deaths, forgetting the quiet passings of very elderly residents in nursing homes? Chapter 7. The Architecture of Belief. To understand why the Midnight Death Omen holds such power, one must understand the relationship between humans and time. Anthropologist Mary Douglas wrote extensively about how societies create order through ritual and belief, how we impose patterns on chaos to make existence bearable. The turn of the year represents one of humanity's oldest ritualized moments, a chance to press restart, to believe that time moves in cycles rather than in an inevitable march toward entropy. Ancient Romans celebrated Janus, the two-faced god who looked simultaneously backward and forward, at the new year. Medieval Christians saw the moment as spiritually dangerous, a time when demons might slip through the cracks between years. Even in our secular age, New Year's Eve carries ritualistic weight. Resolutions are made, sins are forgiven, fresh starts are promised. Death at midnight on New Year's Eve violates this script. Instead of renewal, there is an ending. Instead of promise, there is prophecy, and a dark one. The person who dies becomes a sacrifice not to celebrate the new year but to curse it, their final exhalation a hex upon the coming months. In medieval European death beliefs, timing mattered intensely. To die on Good Friday was considered blessed. To die excommunicated was to risk eternal damnation. The ars moriendi, art of dying, literature that flourished from the 15th to 17th centuries prescribed exact procedures for the moment of death, including prayers, positions, and witnesses. Death was a performance with cosmic consequences. The Midnight Omen draws on these older traditions while adapting them to a newer, clock-based understanding of time. It requires precise measurement, not death on the night of New Year's but specifically at midnight, at the exact transitional second. This precision reflects modernity's obsession with exactitude even as the belief itself remains pre-modern. Chapter 8. The Turning Point. August arrived with record heat. The old folks of Hollowmere moved slowly through humid days, and several were hospitalized for dehydration and heat exhaustion. But none died. September brought relief in cooler temperatures and the return of school routines. Mrs. Chen, examining her diary on September 1st, counted 14 deaths so far. She couldn't remember the count from previous years with precision. Who keeps such grim statistics? But it felt like more. It felt significant. Yet when her grandson, home from medical school, gently suggested she was experiencing confirmation bias, she bristled. "I've lived here 70 years," she told him. "I know when something is wrong." "Grandma," he said patiently, "the human mind is incredibly good at finding patterns, even when they don't exist. It's called apophenia. Plus, you're more likely to remember deaths this year because you're looking for them. Last year's deaths don't feel as important because there was no omen triggering your attention." She wanted to argue, but his explanation nagged at her. Was she creating the pattern she feared? Were the elders of Hollowmere participating in a collective delusion, frightening themselves with shadows of their own making? Still, when October brought a house fire that killed the Martinez family, parents and 2 teenage children, the town's grief felt apocalyptic. 4 deaths in a single night, the smell of smoke lingering in the air for days, the charred skeleton of the house serving as a constant reminder of mortality's sudden violence. At the memorial service, Father Benedict spoke of God's mysterious ways of faith in the face of incomprehensible loss. He was new to Hollowmere, having arrived only the year before, and he knew nothing of midnight omens or New Year's superstitions. But Mrs. Chen, sitting in the back pew, found no comfort in his words. The count was now 18, and October had only just begun. Chapter 9. The Science of Coincidence. Mathematicians and statisticians have long studied the phenomenon of meaningful coincidence. The field of probability theory reveals that unlikely events occur more frequently than intuition suggests, precisely because of the vast number of opportunities for coincidence to occur. Consider the famous birthday paradox. In a room of just 23 people, there's a 50% chance that 2 share a birthday. Our intuition says this is impossible. With 365 days in a year, surely you'd need many more people. But the math proves otherwise. Similarly, our intuition about death patterns is often wrong. In any population, deaths cluster randomly. A month might see no deaths, then 3 in 1 week, not because of causal connection but because randomness produces clusters. Humans, however, are exquisitely tuned to detect patterns, an evolutionary advantage when patterns might indicate predators or food sources, but a source of false belief when applied to random distributions. The physicist Max Tegmark wrote about what he called the mathematical universe, where all possible arrangements of matter and energy exist. In such a universe, every conceivable coincidence must occur somewhere, sometime. The question isn't whether unlikely events happen. They must, but whether we correctly interpret their meaning. Elias Thorne's death at midnight on New Year's Eve was unlikely in its precise timing, but not meaningfully so. Human hearts fail constantly, across all hours of day and night. That one failed at midnight on December 31st was no more significant than if it had failed at 11:47 p.m. on March 3rd, except for the meaning that folklore assigned to it. Chapter 10: November's Reckoning. The count reached 22 by early November. A farming accident. A recurrence of cancer that had been in remission. A suicide that shocked everyone who knew the victim, a young woman who had seemed to have everything to live for. Each death carried its own story, its own constellation of grief and aftermath. Mrs. Chen had stopped keeping her diary. The act of recording deaths had become too heavy, transforming her from observer to chronicler of catastrophe. But she couldn't stop noticing, couldn't ignore the funerals that seemed to multiply, the obituaries in the local paper that consumed more column inches each week. At a town council meeting in mid-November, called ostensibly to discuss winter road maintenance, the unspoken anxiety finally surfaced. Councilman Green, whose family had lived in Hollowmere for 6 generations, stood during public comment. "I think we need to acknowledge," he began carefully, "that this has been a difficult year for our community. We've lost more neighbors than usual. I'm not saying why, or suggesting anything supernatural, but maybe we should organize a community memorial service. Something to help us process collective grief." The room fell silent. Everyone understood what he wasn't saying, the superstition he was skirting around. Mayor Hopkins, pragmatic and modern in her thinking, nodded slowly. "I think that's a thoughtful suggestion," she said. "Grief can be isolating. Coming together might help." The memorial service was scheduled for December 15th. In preparation, a committee compiled a list of the deceased, collecting photographs and brief biographies. When they finished, the count stood at 24 deaths in Hollowmere proper, plus 3 former residents who had died elsewhere but maintained strong town connections. 27 names. 27 faces in the slideshow that would play during the service. Was this unusually high? The committee chair, a retired accountant named Harold Voss, decided to check historical records. Chapter 11: The Records Speak. Harold spent 3 days in the town hall basement, reviewing death certificates and burial records going back 50 years. What he found surprised him. The data was noisy. Some years saw 10 deaths, others 30. The variation depended on multiple factors: flu severity, heat waves, cold snaps, accidents, and the simple fact that in a small population, random variation produces large swings in percentages. He created a spreadsheet, calculating average annual deaths, 18.4 over the 50-year period. The standard deviation was 6.2, meaning that any given year could reasonably see between 12 and 25 deaths without being statistically unusual. Years with fewer than 12 or more than 25 occurred, but rarely, about once per decade. The current year's count of 27 deaths by early December was high but within the realm of normal variation. It fell just outside one standard deviation but well within two. In statistical terms, it was not an outlier. It was random noise, the kind of variation that always exists in small samples. Harold presented his findings to the Memorial Service Committee. Some members felt relief, others remained skeptical. Numbers don't capture everything, Mrs. Chen argued. They don't account for how the deaths felt, for the tragedy of some of them. She was right, of course. Statistics can't measure grief, can't quantify the hole left by a child's death or the shock of sudden violence. But they could answer the question of whether the year had been objectively deadlier than usual. The answer, Harold's data suggested, was not really. Still, belief is not easily shaken by evidence. As Daniel Kahneman documented in his research on human judgment and decision-making, people weigh personal experience far more heavily than statistical abstraction. Mrs. Chen had lived through the deaths, had attended the funerals, and had felt the accumulation of loss. No spreadsheet could convince her that the pattern was merely random. Chapter 12. The Memorial Service. On December 15th, the community gathered in the Presbyterian Church, the only building large enough to hold the crowd. The slideshow played, faces young and old, each life condensed to a photograph and a few sentences. Emma Hartwell, who loved butterflies. Tom Prescott, who built half the town. Sarah Mitchell, whose students wrote tearful tributes. The Martinez family, whose absence left a palpable void.